Hi, and welcome to From the Research Chair. This is episode 16. We're talking about deception and truth analysis today. I'm Jason Voss, and there's my partner in crime,
Michael Falk.
So this is a subject near and dear to me. For those of you who are in fairly close orbit to me, you probably know that I've worked on deception detection or some form of it for quite some time. Our format today is going to be a little bit different than normal. It's going to be like when Michael and I talked about his book. Namely, Michael is going to interview me, and to keep it clean, and this is how we work when we do embedding work with investment teams.
Clean? You mean you were going to bring some filth into this conversation?
It's a discussion about deception. It's not inevitable, but it's a possibility. But anyway, as per usual, when we work together, we prepare separately. So there's no prepared list of questions. So that gives Michael free rein to ask anything he wants to without me, having a necessarily prepped answer. And Michael,
And now we begin.
go right ahead, my friend.
So, Jason, the first thing I want to ask you to do for our guests, our audience, we're talking about deception and truth analysis. So let's begin. Will you lie to me?
Boy, now I'm trying to think of what I would lie to you about. I bodyguarded for the Dalai Lama. True or false?
And for our audience, as with most lies, there is a nugget of truth in what Jason just said, but it is false.
That is correct. However, I did train to bodyguard for the Dalai Lama.
That is the nugget.
Exactly.
Wow.
So
Never
what
got
do we want to have we need to do two things with this topic today. And we need to ask Jason to help us because this is his brainchild. This is his child. Is we need him to tell us all about it because we want to know. But what we also need him to do is to have a little fun with this, because what an amazing broad topic. So Jason, my first question for you is, what was the cause? What was the motivation for you upwards of a decade ago to pursue this topic?
Well, believe it or not, like formally, it's older than a decade. Back almost 25 years ago, when I started as a fund manager, I learned very quickly I was a research analyst at the time. I learned that I was extremely reliant on the quality of the statements coming from management. Yes, I was trained in financial statement analysis. I think, like most people, probably delusionally so, that I was pretty good at that. But I also understood that investing was a forward-looking activity, and management was a good source for what's the strategy, how are you going to execute it, what do you do if it goes wrong, so on and so forth. And that made me very vulnerable to their truth. And so maybe because I was going through a divorce at the same time, and I thought there was some dishonesty on both sides going back and forth there in that discussion, I got really fascinated by the subject of deception detection. And I read a book back in the day called Never Be Lied to Again, which turns out to be everything that doesn't work about lie detection and everything that I now know is fictional in terms of it. But I've had a deep interest since then. During the course of my career, I didn't really deploy it much. I had certain questioning techniques that I developed that now feature as focused products in terms of management interviews, how to have a conversation, that I thought were fairly effective, but I never had a way of measuring their success. Anyway, to end the thread, when I joined CFA Institute 10 years ago, the
end of the thread is already 10 years. We have 10 years more to go on this thread?
Well, I'm almost done. A couple sentences. So when I joined CFA Institute 10 years ago in 2011, the very first project, almost within the very first sort of day that I started working there, because I knew there was a research budget, was lie detection. And I started work on it, and I reached out to criminal justice professionals who advised different intelligence agencies about what works. And I wanted to create a product for CFA Institute that had the stuff that works. And the subject of today's discussion is one of the things that does work.
So, Jason, you run a company's reports, annual reports. Let's stay within the investment world for just a second. Annual reports every document they produce during the course of the year that is digitally available. You run through it, and there's a score. Is that fair?
A score, you mean a
Mm-hmm.
deception
A
score?
deception score.
That's
True
correct.
or, true or false?
Yes,
A
there's a
buzzer goes off and an alarm sounds and it says, liar, liar, pants on fire. True or false?
false. It doesn't really, that's not quite what that score means. That the score
Okay.
means that
Tell us what the
there's,
score means, Jason.
yeah, the scores for, and what Michael's talking about is deception truth analysis, which is using computers to look for deceptive language or truthful language in documents. And it looks at how people speak, not what they're speaking. So it's not looking for red flag words. It doesn't understand context. So let me like explain a little bit of background.
You're going to give context to the fact that it doesn't explain context.
Exactly. Yeah. People do context. Michael, you and I talk about this frequently. We would make
Yeah.
it a podcast subject, but probably not too many people would be very interested in that subject. But in any case, what it looks at is very similar to a stock screen. So we provide the context when we do stock screens as investors at the top end of many people's process, because we know that if a company has grown its earnings per share consistently over the course of, say, 20 quarters, 5 years, that company probably is well managed. So we're using a data point as indirect evidence of something else. So data works in a similar way. It's looking at things like how many first person pronouns does somebody use relative to how many second person pronouns and third person pronouns. And it's looking at usage of parts of speech and the way verbs are used and things like that. So it's actually fairly stupid in a certain sense, the same way stock screens are stupid, but because it bridges human understanding with quantity, it provides useful results. So our scores, they range between -100, which is strongly deceptive, to +100, which is strongly truthful. On average, like it's sometimes you'll see violations of that range, but we've normalized the score so it's there. And what does the score mean? It means not that definitively with 100% accuracy that somebody has told the truth or is lying. It says relative to other communications of this kind, this one is, say the score is 65, it's 65% likely to be, or it's in the 65% range, meaning strong likelihood of it being true. If the score is -39, it says that relative to other documents of this kind, there's a high likelihood it's deceptive. So it's really about probabilities more so than it is certainties.
And that is a great clarification for our listeners. I went down the path of liar purposefully because people need to understand there's a difference there.
Yeah.
A fascination personally that I can, well, I'll throw this log on the fire. All right. If we had a time series, 10 years, 20 years, taking it out of the investment marketplace just for a second about political discourse, would we find that the scale actually needs to change because of how bad political discourse has become?
It's an interesting question. You'll be thrilled to know that I've been busily gathering databases of known lies, and which turns out to be a very tricky thing because it means that somebody has done research to verify a factual statement. And I've gotten 3 of those databases, and in fact, the last 2 weeks I've been busily testing deception truth analysis to some of these databases. One of which in particular is considered the gold standard for text-based deception research, and I've got some interesting results there that this would be the first forum I discuss in it. But anyway, I have looked at not political speech, but I have looked at annual, since 2009 forward, whether or not there are more deceptive words now than there used to be, or use of deceptive language, and the answer is no. The data series, at least within business, seems to be fairly stable. In other words, the standard deviation remains pretty constant as you roll that database forward.
Which is a very useful piece of data, because then it begs the question, why have some political discourses gotten so harsh and negative given that fact? But where that takes me Jason, and this is where, well, we work together on deep investment topics, so our fascination overlaps consistently. Facts and narratives. I was working with a team up in Canada last fall, sales team, which people are saying, Michael, what the hell is a sales team doing with you? Fair point. However, facts don't motivate behavior. Narratives motivate behavior. Sales teams usually are arming themselves with facts. You need to build yourself narratives around those facts. I mean, we need truth, but you need narratives. Jason, what you're parsing is really the narratives, not the facts. Tell people more about that a little bit, because you've got some great data to talk about what's narrative and what's fact.
Yeah, and in surprising data, I'll say, because the way deception and truth analysis works is to compare a subject document to a gigantic database of similar documents. I have in that normative data a lot of very, well, I think curious factoids, and probably the single greatest thing I could share with our audience today is 13.5. And what is the context for that? Why is it important? Only 13.5% of the information contained in annual reports
On average, right?
on average is numeric. The other 86.5% are words. All of our techniques, everything in the CFA charter, for example, other than the ethics portion, is all designed to analyze those numbers. And there's another interesting thing about the numbers. And Michael,
So is this the drunk looking for the keys they lost in the field, searching under the lamppost, Jason? Is that what the CFA curriculum is teaching us?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And there are other techniques, like there are lots of ways to parse with AI or machine learning, all of those numbers too, and many people do. But the interesting thing about numbers, and this is a point I've made for years and years and years, there is no such thing as a future fact. And because numbers are facts, that means they're always backward looking. They're the result of the actions and behaviors taken on by people, in this case, business managers at companies. The numbers are a result. They're an outcome of behaviors. Behaviors are the choices.
Unless they're an outright fraud, and then they're just made up.
In which case it's just made up. And the reason why I bring this up is one of the interesting results for deception truth analysis, and one of the analyses I've done, is once the algorithms were built, I said, let's turn their attention to the 10 largest frauds in corporate history. And it identified all 10, and this is the scary thing, or interesting thing. I think it's kind of scary.
Useful thing, if you're going where I think you are.
Useful thing. But
language matters,
but the
sir.
average lead time was 6.6 years. So what that means is, if we're looking at the 86.5% of information that is locked up in words.
What lead time?
6.6 years.
What is the lead time referring to?
Negative deception scores. Yeah, so data is able to identify, you can do it in a time series, Jonathan. So you can look at a score, say in 1993, then 94, 95, by analyzing annual reports, and data on average 6.6 years before scandals become public knowledge is registering negative scores, and then consistently negative scores. And what's fascinating to me about that is, if we look at that 86.5%, people's behaviors are revealed well before the numbers of the outcomes reveal the behaviors. So it's an early warning system that I didn't frankly anticipate. I had no idea what the result would be. When we turned data to the attention of these companies and I saw that number, I wish I had the beep so I could cuss here, but oh my blanking God, I was shocked that it had been that high and that the lead time had been that good. And
you know what I think about that lead time, Jason? Incredibly useful. Let me explain what I mean by useful, because people might say 6+ years. That's useful, Michael. You got to understand, this is a degree sensitivity to deception. And what that means is, the first time you get a negative result, you're going to be like, well, that's interesting. The second time you get a negative result, alarm bells might go off. But let's be candid, not everybody in this audience is an early adopter. Now I shifted to technology. Third time you get a consistent negative result, you're probably going to start to pay real attention, if only. Which means that with a 6+ year lead time, Jason, you give the slow adopters, the people who need to gain more trust over time, which is not a bad thing. You give them the ability to avoid the real big blowups because of that amount of lead time. And that's why I say, wow,
Change happens at the
useful.
Jonathan, what was your question? I think that was Jonathan.
It was.
What was your question? Jonathan, I don't know if you've lost the connection. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here. I've got not incredible bandwidth here. I'm down in the URA National Forest in North Carolina. And that's the truth. Change happens at the margin. Events cast their shadows before, not after.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and some of the data in particular on those scandals.
Events don't just boom happen right in the middle. There's something happened on the margin. Whether it's the butterfly flapping his wings up on the avalanche, the top of the avalanche or something, somebody gets the idea, oh, nobody's watching. I see that dollar. It doesn't just, it's almost type 2 thinking instead of type 1 thinking.
I think
well, if we think about go into science for a second, we know about how critical states occur, right? Water freezes, water boils. There's a critical state. We know it's building one way or the other in that example of water. Jason's technology data is able to get a sense of that 6+ years, giving people time to do more research, make more inquiry. If you're not going to act on it immediately, but you have time to react, and that's the beneficial, useful nature of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and Michael, you raise a very important point with let's put ourselves in the shoes of people who are using deception truth analysis circa whatever year they get a negative score from one of these companies. They're likely to scratch their head and wonder if it's statistical noise. And I'm starting to gather, because I've been testing the algorithms with the gold standard database I referred to before, like if there's an error, what is the size of the error? So what size score do you need to, have X amount of confidence? And I don't have anything really to report on that. I'm still working through that, because literally we're talking millions of data points and whatever. But in any case, the likely result is you're going to roll up your sleeves and call up management and try and use some other skill set to try and answer the question whether you think there's fraud. Now, next year, if you see the same result, well, that's even more interesting. Third year, fourth year, fifth year, and to your point, we have to overcome people's behavior, and they have to trust that these things are true before they'll believe it. One of the interesting things, if you look at the time series of some of these companies, like Adelphia comes to mind, Adelphia is one of the top 10, is when the scandal broke, the year prior to the actual scandal, they had a statement from their accountants where they issued a qualified, not an unqualified opinion on their financial statements. And they said they were not going to be issuing an annual report. I think it was in 2000 or 2001. I can't remember. 2000. We'll just say 2000.
Okay.
And then they didn't issue that annual report the next year either. Then the scandal broke. Then they finally issued an annual report, I think in 2002. And lo and behold, their deception scores went from around like the minus, if memory serves, 50-ish% range, which is a high level of deception, to positive 5%. So it's kind of in the noisy range, but with the auditors from the SEC and their own auditors working on it, it did boink or bounce back up into the positive zone, but then they were acquired. So their history disappeared. And that's what happens to most of those scandal companies is they don't continue on as a going concern and they disappear. Waste management's another one though, and waste management was negative, negative, negative. Scandal broke, and then they've been in the positive range since. So the score is sensitive to behaviors and changes at these organizations.
No, it's interesting, Jason, from what you just said. So maybe a little scandal to clean up things, not such a bad thing as long as you can avoid the scandalous period.
Well, sure. I'm not sure as an investor I would agree with a little scandal is a good thing.
Well, the point that I'm trying to make is we so often experience with teams we work with, when they have a bad experience with a stock, it's dead to them. As an example,
Sure.
They will never, ever, ever invest. And we're not talking about frauds here. Maybe should we bring that, don't blackball even for these types of companies? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that that's legitimate, especially if management's changed and the scores that we're seeing would indicate to me the following. There's a operating hypothesis that deceivers or behaviors are what leads to the outcome, right? So that's the hypothesis. And so if you see a change in the scores, you've likely also seen a change in the behaviors. I think that that's a fairly safe assumption. And that's not just based on these algorithms, it's based on, and we haven't brought it up really today much, tangent. I have a vast interest in lie detection and deception detection in general. Data is just an electronic technology. Those of you who work with me at Focus know that I also have a deep and abiding interest in deception detection in general, and interview techniques, one-on-one talking and conversation is also a highly accurate way of rendering deception. So the lie detection theory for interviewing affirms basically what the data here are actually showing.
So, Jason, tell our guests, if you were still running money, how would you use a tool like this if you were still a PM?
Yeah, I would use it in lots of different ways. One use case would be to, on an ongoing basis, as the earnings season unfolds, and say your coverage universe is 100 names for your research staff, not for you personally. 100 names is unrealistic for a person, but say your research staff has 100 names that they're trying to digest and follow closely. You could run these quarterly reports or annual reports through data, get the scores, and if you ideally have a time series, you can see if there are any fluctuations. If there are any fluctuations, you can turn the limited resource of your research team to those companies to dig a little bit deeper, maybe do more channel checks, call management, ideally equipped with deception detection interviewing techniques, so that you can get to the truth of it, and allows you to focus your limited resources on productive activities. So that's one. Two would be, do your whole portfolio at least once, see if you have any black sheep in there. That would be an interesting exercise. You may have a ticking time bomb that you're unaware of within your portfolio, which the outcome of that may be that you have a handful of companies that score strongly deceptive. God forbid, maybe you don't, maybe they're weakly deceptive, but either way, you can again direct your resources to, hey, what do I really think is going on here? I now have a second opinion and a more objective opinion as well. And we can cover that if you want. And then another one would be in time series in general, just always track this. Another would be as a stock screening tool on the front end. So you've done all your fundamental work to create your fishing pond, and maybe all of a sudden you see an alert. You've added in data scores to your thing, and everything looks good, but too good, because the data score is saying, minus 40% in terms of truthfulness. And so there are myriad applications we haven't even talked about. We're talking about within investing. Auditors could use this as well. ESG.
Oh, no, stay with investments for a moment. Come on.
ESG folks could use it to see if they could trust whether or not people are actually adhering to ESG type stuff. Anyway, Michael.
The screening point, Jason, is so interesting to me as kind of a gating or a threshold type mechanism before the team spends research time and the portfolio maybe purchases, takes a position. I just can't help but wonder because how long does it take to look at one company? How long does the software take?
milliseconds. So we did clock tests on the speed, and my partner in this is a company called Orbit Technologies, and all they do is natural language processing. They're based in the UK. The IP, the intellectual property, is mine. They're providing the platform, which is where data as a tool exists. And we were doing clock times on how fast, and it's our estimate that data can assess 70,400 words per second. Human beings take
Less. We'll
yeah,
just say less.
yeah, takes way, 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 way more time. It's our estimate that the time savings is 99.997%. And that comes from research that exists, which I know from being a writer. How many words per minute can people read? How many words max to occupy 10 minutes of a person's time? So it's about 125 words with comprehension. So that's what these numbers are based on, is 120.
So back to my question again. I want
Yeah,
to take people down it's a little thread. Don't worry. It doesn't take very long
it's
to
almost
put
instantaneous. Yeah.
right. So there's not a time excuse that a researcher might use, a PM might use. We're not going to put this gate in front of our research. Okay, gate down. Now, you have limited time as an analyst or PM, pick your title, limited time to spend. You're responsible for maintaining knowledge and current news on everything that you already own. You also have to find new ideas. You also have to research those new ideas. Time is a very precious commodity. Jason, it seems to me that if this were simply used as a rule, as a threshold gating mechanism, that the ability for professionals in the investment space to become so much more efficient and effective is like off the charts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And we haven't even talked about, it's outside the scope of today's conversation, but separate product that I've been developing and that we've used at Focus Consulting is you can also get behavioral indicators of what's going on. And that could also then become a very fascinating stock screen. I just want to take this brief tangent for a second, because that's probably data, we'll call it version 3.0, where we're not just rendering it an opinion on deceptiveness or truthfulness, but also revealing behavioral cues. How is this interesting? Well, relative to the discussion we were having earlier about numbers ultimately being outcomes based on behaviors, imagine you take what we call ABLE, automatic behavioral analysis with language, and we run it on your existing portfolio and the portfolio of companies you've invested in, say, over a decade, and we see behavioral fingerprints. What that allows us to do is then that becomes a gating mechanism for your screens as well, because by the time it's in your numbers, the market's figured it out too, which is why value investors, fundamental investors have had such a hard time competing, is they're waiting for the numbers to be there. And by the time they've waited, they've been discounted. So the advantage is gone. But now imagine you have a behavioral cue of, hey, this company and their management team behave, as the linguistics would suggest, in exactly the way all of our favorite companies do. We should take a look at them, and you now have an early warning system for what should be in the pond soon and sooner. Anyway, that's a digression. That product exists. It just hasn't been automated yet.
So I like that very much. Now I'm going to give you freedom to leave the investment world and talk about just how exciting the opportunities could be for this technology you've built in other spaces.
I mean, imagine you're watching the nightly news and somebody is speaking. You mentioned politicians earlier, and you have
No, I said political discourse. Okay. I'm steering clear of politicians.
Okay, all right, fair point. So political discourse is taking place. There's a subject matter expert or a politician on the nightly news, and you could have a deception score, running along the bottom, and with whatever the lag is from speech to text and the accuracy of speech to text, and it's showing you blocks or sections of the veracity of what they've said.
Now I'm excited. So if we did that, when it goes below a certain level, the audio cuts out automatically. Well, if you're not going to speak any truth, we don't need to listen anymore.
Well, that's I hadn't thought of that application. I rather like that. I wonder what the
No,
fallout
we
from that kind of
don't.
activity.
Well, certain news networks might no longer have any sound. I'm sorry. All right, carry on,
Yeah.
Jason. Next application.
Well,
If you haven't figured it out yet, folks, I'm the comic relief for this topic. Jason, what other dimensions, what other areas might this be very, very valuable in?
dating sites, right? Dating apps, right? So imagine, people have their profile and they've got their words that describe them up there, and you're using this. That said, it's important to point out that because it works on sampling and statistics, the smaller the sample, the less reliable the result. And you get to about 90% accuracy for identifying both truth and deception at 800 words and above. So to put that in perspective, most written words or printed pages, around 250-ish words. So you need about 3 pages. Most people in their profiles are not going to write 3 pages. So the
No,
reliability.
no. When I talk about my luxurious wavy hair, but I don't show a picture, you're not going to be able to detect that. That is not true.
Yeah, yeah, this would not work there for the very reason that the context is, let's look at a picture of Michael, but it also is looking at the way people use language. And we actually haven't said very much about how data works. I think it's an important point.
So why don't you tell us?
Yeah, so the way data works is it relies on parsing a document. And it literally looks at every word in a document from the first word all the way to the last word, and it categorizes it into different language fingerprint categories. So one might be verb, right? Is this word a verb? Yes, it is. Okay, then click, it's a verb. Is it a motion verb? Yes. Is it a verb like seeing that relates to sensory activities? Yes. Is it a first person pronoun? Yes. So on and so forth. And it looks at 97 different things on the front end, different fingerprints. Of those 97, I'm not going to quite say how many we're looking at because this is part of the secret sauce, but it looks at, our library of algorithms look at over 30 of those fingerprints to render a judgment about the deception of truth. And it's looking at how people use language, not what language they say. An important point, because people have tried to develop similar technologies by quickly scanning, using computers, annual reports for changes in language, like if there's a boilerplate language change, or if they use words like lawsuit or bankruptcy or factor, FACTOR, right? People who factor receivables. If those words appear, ooh, red flag. The problem with that is people released about 6 years ago research that showed that those things were predictive of future poor stock price performance. They updated the research in the fall, and it no longer is advantageous because companies have learned and steered away from that. And they've also excised, CEOs have hired speech coaches to excise the offending language from how they communicate. So you have to look at something more sophisticated, and this is how people use language, not what language they use.
That's critical because people, you will hear the messages based upon all the coaching, all the learnedness of people who are professionals in simply creating messages. And they're smart enough and talented enough to make sure that the messages don't trigger.
Yeah, and I have one last thing to add, and then the story about how it works is complete. So it looks at the various language fingerprints, and it looks at a given document's fingerprints relative to an entire normative database, not a normative database of deceptive documents, just all documents. There may be some deceptive contained within there. It doesn't really matter. And then when it looks at those fingerprints, it looks at known fingerprints associated with deceptive speech developed out of sample. So this is an important point. The fingerprints are based on how people in general deceive, not how financial people or business people deceive, but how people deceive. I have adapted this literature and this scientific research that's over a decade old to finance, because I asked myself a hypothetical question many years ago, which is, could this be used, the general way people deceive, be used on financial documents? And the answer is yes. So, and then it renders a score, and then the score is normalized to make it sensible, so that the scores are comparable across documents. But that's how it works.
Auditing, legal, courts of law.
Oh, I forgot legal. Yeah, witness testimony is one of the databases we want to build out.
The applications are endless. Really, when you think about it, if we could scrub untruth or hedged statements from communications, there's really no area of business or life that we wouldn't argue might be able to be enhanced substantially and quickly. Am I going too far, Jason, or am I pulling on an appropriate thread?
I think you're pulling an appropriate thread. I mean, it's early days. The app has been live all of two weeks as of today, and we won our first several customers. We'll start to get feedback from folks. And Michael, my screen is showing you're frozen, by the way. If you're still there, maybe turn off your video for a second.
I'm still here. I don't know what happened.
There you go. Okay, now you're back just as soon as you said
Maybe
that.
I just needed to move. You thought I was frozen. I was just very still.
No. You most certainly froze, my friend. Not a pixel. That nary a pixel on your head moved there for a moment. In any case, now I've lost my train of thought. In terms of other applications, yeah, I think they're nearly endless because people are so reliant upon the statements of others. In fact, it's even in an annual report, which is a very numbers-driven document, 13.5% is all the numbers in there. Everything else is verbal.
It's narratives. Narratives, we tell stories because that's how we engage people.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming we want to try and engage someone. Tell a story. All right. Now, these are narratives we create, and language and narratives, they're inextricably linked,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're not telling a story in numbers or bits or bytes. We're using words. Words are power, and language decoded is power. Jason, I'm thinking of a mood ring type of device. And if we could have a data mood ring that everybody wore
Mm-hmm.
because it was required, and it just showed color. Oh my. Oh my.
Well, yeah, that to me is a world I wouldn't want to live in. I rather like the world of we'll just use data for more specific uses. This is, by the way.
So too much truth might be a bad thing?
Well, this you've hit on a subject that's quite fascinating within the lie detection research space, which is there a difference between a lie and deception? The answer is yes.
Yes. There's a reason I went here.
Yeah. So lie is what we're trying to prevent. Deception is, and sometimes actually warranted. So for example, we don't necessarily want the culture that Bridgewater has set up for folks with radical candor, because radical candor works if there's an environment of compassion present. Otherwise, it becomes a quite vicious sort of a thing. So when your wife or your husband asks you, do I look okay? You probably want them to deceive you. Grandma probably wants you to deceive her, if I may be so sexist, when she's prepared Thanksgiving meal and she says, how is it? She probably wants to hear yes. So there are social reasons for deceiving. It doesn't necessarily constitute a lie or something that's fraudulent. Any case.
Jason, I'm glad you went there. This was my intention, because what I want to share with our listeners is, if somebody is trying to deceive, they could be sandbagging. They may not be trying to avoid telling you bad news. Sandbagging because something good is expected with the business as well. I'm back in the investment world, forgive me. So it's really important that when you get a data score, Jason, give me feedback on what I'm about to say. Really important that it is about your investigation, not a reaction. It's about what you do with that score, not what you take action with. Jason, fair or unfair on my part?
I think, like most things, if I surface time horizon into the discussion, then I can offer a qualified yes, but
Mm.
no. And the
So bring your little time horizon fetish into the conversation.
Yeah, so here's what I know. There was research just published last month, January 2021, fresh,
That's pretty current.
yeah, as fresh as it gets, and it looked at human beings' ability to detect deception in written texts. I couldn't have asked for a more timely piece of research. And what they found is that human beings are just 50% able to discern truth from documents.
So
Very,
I should use my lucky coin.
it's a literal spot on coin flip. It's actually worse than our ability to detect deception in everyday conversations or settings where it's just 54%. So text-based analysis and data, we haven't surfaced it yet today, is I just have been doing the testing over the last week, 85% accurate when the word count is above 800. So if you have 800 words or more, the average is 85% for discerning truth and lies. So there are false positives and false negatives on both
That's
sides.
amazing.
And that's a significant improvement. And by the way, just 3% worse than the best interviewing technology, which is called strategic use of evidence, which has logged 88% success rate. And Stu requires some training. This requires no training. So I'm super enthused. But in any case, what do you do with that score? I think right now, early days, most people will not trust the score that they would get from data. They'll probably want to deploy their human abilities and their research analysis skills to assess the score and its accuracy rather than trusting it. That
Mhm.
piece of research looked at that question. So it looked at human beings' accuracy, just 50%. They then looked at two other conditions, quite fascinating. Human beings' ability to veto the score as rendered by computers, and then they looked at, they gave people carte blanche to adjust the score completely if they wanted to. The accuracy again dropped to around that 50% range. Then the third condition is you can only adjust it plus or minus 2%. And lo and behold, it dropped by exactly 2% because most people were adjusting downward to their max and the accuracy dropped by 2%. So early days, I think people are likely to not trust the score. They'll go take their score and probably try to do something with it. And they'll think, I'm qualified. I have 20 years of investment experience and I'm going to do this. And that would be me. At this juncture, this is still new technology to me, the developer of this technique. I probably would doubt the scores too. But I think the more success people have with this, fast forward 10 years, and we have really good data on false positives and false negatives, and people's adaptive response and whether or not data can swerve around it and it's not spoofable very easily. I can see people trusting this more than they would trust themselves, but I have no
So
way.
over time, the hypothesis is that it will gain people's trust and it will become possibly more effective as a result of that. But in the interim, I'm not going down the path of saying people should doubt the scores. I'm saying if you get a wonky score, go do some homework and find these are breadcrumbs, people, if only. Now you always have the choice, right? If there are 100 potential securities within your sector that you have responsibility for, I'm going to give you a narrative. And you have limited time and you get a couple of the 100 that produce big negative scores, maybe just push on to the other 98 to think about and don't waste any additional time. Listen, there are a lot of ways this can be used. Jason, this is such a meaty topic, and you have brought a beautiful child into this world. So
Mhm.
now we need to nurture this child. We need to let people know this child exists.
Mm.
What are some of your expected or hopeful next steps for data?
Well, I mean, in terms of the development of the app and refinements to the app, the answer is we've done preliminary experiments with, let me half a step back. A natural follow-up question to the score, right? You've gotten a deception score is great. Okay, I trust that it may be negative. I'll trust that it's a hypothesis to be confirmed or denied. Where in the document is the deception? And that problem is solved by taking rolling samples through the document The data or the information I'm about to quote to you was done with 750 word samples. I know from my work over the last week, we get about 90-ish% above 800, or sorry, 85% at 800 words. At 750, it drops a little bit. I would like to do 800 word rolling samples through documents. But with 750, we've done some preliminary things. It is sensitive to where in documents the deception is occurring.
Brilliant. So breadcrumbs with a flashlight included.
Within a range. And the way we've done it and the way it will be built out is, say if it's 800 words, we'll take the first word through the 800th word, but then the 400th word through the 1200th word and roll forward. And then if you have deception and that's tangent to itself and you have a graph, you have pretty high reliability, say within this 400 word range, which is roughly a page and a half, page and 2/3 of text, with fairly good certainty, this is where the deception is taking place. Then your human analysis and your years of experience becomes fascinating because you can drill in. And by the way, the documents that we've looked at, it's exactly the sort of a language that would alarm you potentially, or if you had a trained eye, you'd go, huh, that is something I need to pay attention to. That's important. So go ahead.
No, finish your thought, because I have a question that I think I need to ask.
Yeah, so we'll call that data 2.0, right? That
Okay.
Some work and some computing power. The speed is going to slow down, and we want to test it on a wider sample. We've done it
So
on.
you mean it may take a minute to get the results on a stock?
Yeah, probably less. For those various samples, what has to happen is, say you have a JP Morgan annual report, which is 212,000 words ish, right? It's big. You have to divide it in 800 word segments and then test each one individually.
Yeah.
It's the front end parsing that will take time. The actual scores rendered will be, milliseconds.
I don't think a minute, if it slows down to a minute, people are going to be really agitated. It's a hypothesis, but you can test it.
Probably not. Version 3.0 would be to layer in the behavioral stuff that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. I can't help but call out our industry on something. I'm not sure that a large proportion of the investment industry reads anymore. Listen, I don't mean reading in general. I mean reading the annual reports, reading the 10Qs, 10Ks, and every financial release. Jason, I'm not convinced people are reading everything still. Am I off base, or is that reasonable?
I think that's accurate. And this may restore, Michael, you didn't say it, but it sparked a thought. This may trigger an increase in the amount of reading, especially version 2.0 of data with this section needs your attention. People may start to read all annual reports and their critical sections. So
one way or the other, you are going to improve the quality of research, it sounds like.
I hope so. Let's get lots of customers in place, and then we can answer that question better.
Well, I have only one more question before we open it up to our guests at this point. Unless, Jason, you want to freestyle, just share something that I haven't covered or triggered at this point.
No, not really.
I have the question that's got to be on somebody's mind that's listening. What is this going to cost? Oh my God. I mean, can people afford this thing?
Well, I mean, that's all relative, but we tried to price it so that we attract no competitors. Like the competitive price, the value add price would be $1,000, which is, we had some initial conversations with folks and they said that was too expensive for a single report. And based on the feedback we did, we are charging 80 British pounds or $110 US per report, which I think is reasonable, but the market will tell us if that's reasonable.
So I'm going to use a rough number, $100. US, forgive me, people. I'm using the American bias here, forgive me. $100. And what does the average person in our business make?
Journalists, 70,000 US. So the cost savings is around 90%. And it's more accurate and obviously much, 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 much faster.
But we're not suggesting to get rid of analysts.
Nope.
No. We are suggesting put the analysts on steroids?
I think that's what will happen. They call that centaur in the AI and ML machine learning community, which is man and machine or person and machine. And I think that's probably the first obvious use case for this.
Yeah, I've been talking about human plus machine. It's in my last book. It's in, I think, both of my books that I've written. At this point, people have been patient with my bad humor. Questions. What are you folks curious about? What maybe did we touch on that was of interest and we just didn't give you enough satisfaction?
I have a question.
Gordon, please.
The deception score seems to be targeting accounting fraud and bad experiences, and you may have addressed this a little bit. These behavioral cues that you talk about, is that an attempt to identify deception which may have or will likely have a positive outcome, such as hiring a new CEO who can turn companies around or will sell it or something like that? Does anything you're doing distinguish between bad outcomes and good outcomes for the investor?
Not a great question, Gordon. No, and here's why. There is something I need to add here that approximates that. The reason why is, again, we're not looking at context. We're evaluating language for its fingerprints and saying, is this document's language fingerprints similar to those when people are deceiving? So I'll give you an example. And I don't want to give too many of these away because this is of course, the secret sauce. But one of the language fingerprints that's indicative of deception is that truth tellers, when asked to retell a story, use a lot of motion words. So if I say to you, Gordon, talk to me about the last time you went to the grocery store, you are likely to recount, well, I took a shower, I put on my clothes, I got in my car, or I walked, or I bicycled somewhere. At the store, I did this, then I drove home. There are lots of motion words in that narrative. Liars don't have lots of motion words. Instead, they have lots of perception words, which tend to be abstract. So they would say something like, I saw the grocery store and I went in, right? Or I looked at my cupboard and I saw, that the cupboard was bare. So they're making lots of references to things they've seen, heard, tasted, because that they think is how they build a narrative. But in fact, truth tellers tend to recount it from memory. They replay it in memory and describe what they're seeing. And that's a replay of an actual event that happened. So that's one of the distinctions. It's not contextual, though. It could be that just happens to be the way a person speaks, which is why the other language fingerprints are important. Because when coupled together, and by the way, we're using a library of algorithms, not just one, to compare scores, right? And to render an overall result. So no, it's not looking at context. It wouldn't be able to assess that kind of a thing about your question with the CEO. That said, there are two scores that we report, a deception score and a fraud score, because some deception may be present where the fraud score would be lower. For example, companies like to guide earnings down. So here you would expect that the gap between deception and fraud would be wide. Would be narrow because the deception score would be high and the fraud score is designed to be false positive. So let me throw numbers on here. So the fraud score might be minus 30, meaning probably fraudulent activity. The deception score might normally be, if they were trying to guide earnings down, plus 20. But if there's some deception present, you might see that score push down. The fraud score would remain the same. And so the deception score would lower, and so that would narrow. So that would indicate fraud level consistent, deception, it's dropped a little bit. What's going on here? And so if you do a time series, that would cause you to go, I wonder if the quarter's going to be really good and they're just trying to guide us down here. That would be especially useful if you provide a human context. I just looked at an earnings call transcript and they haven't baked the quarter yet. They're just predicting next quarter, but they may have some transparency into how the current quarter, not yet reported, is already gone. So that would be an example of that.
Gordon, thank you for that question. It goes back to the principle maybe I didn't do a real good job on earlier on the podcast. Deception could be for nefarious or positive reasons, right? I'm not ready to tell you that we just got a new link in our supply chain that's more safe and secure, but I can't tell you that. right? Or I'm not willing to say that yet, versus a link in my supply chain is irreparably broken. All right. Good and bad. But so thank you for asking that question. That's a very important point. Deception doesn't talk about necessarily direction. You have to look into that when
Yeah.
you get a score that's worthy of looking into.
Yeah, and one quick point, Jonathan, I saw you have a question, just 2 seconds. That's one of the reasons I put the deception and fraud score in there, because the damage from fraud is so high. We're able to not bias, but we are able to offer, the fraud score is almost like an unfiltered score, right? It's not adjusting for the possibility of truth. It's saying, hey, look, the things that we look at that measure possibility of deception, we're reporting that straight. But the deception score, we recognize that people can be deceptive and truthful at the same time. And so consequently, those are adjusted. So the deception scores are almost always, in fact, I can only think of one, literally one out of thousands run. It's a situation where the deceptive score was not above the fraud score. So that we're trying to account for that very thing. Jonathan, you had a question?
Are people writing better or worse than they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
No idea.
Well, Jonathan, let me ask, when you say are people writing, you mean in terms of annual reports or something else?
Annual reports, transcripts, analyst meetings, things like this.
I can answer that indirectly, and I'll quote the information I shared with you before. When the report last fall came out from, I think it was reported in Bloomberg, that initial foray into deception detection of red flag words, and the researchers updated their research and they saw that CEOs were adjusting by excising those words from their annual reports, as well as engaged with speech coaches to make sure they didn't use that specific language. I thought, oh, well, I have to see if my stuff is being spoofed too. Maybe the other people are looking at similar things. And the way to do that is to see if the standard deviations of the language fingerprints remain stable. But it also answers your question because the language fingerprints are highly stable over from 2009 up through last year. So you would expect that there'd be a lot of movement in the standard deviations if in fact that were the case. But in fact, 2009 compared to 2018 or 19 or whatever year or even block of years, that score is really stable. So I think it's about the same.
And that does make some sense, right? If only when we think about public markets, handful of frauds over the years. Yeah, again, I'm specifying fraud versus the thousands and thousands of companies. Right? There's a reason that there's a bias towards not being a fraud. Deception is a different topic, and that's why this is about deception and truth analysis, not fraud analysis specifically, but that is an aspect of it.
Yeah, and besides the lovely acronym behind my head, the reason we say deception and not lie in truth detection is it's really hard to know 100% if there's a lie. It's really hard also 100% to know if what ground truth is, for example. Really, really shockingly difficult to know what ground truth is because a lot of it, especially text-based, relies on self-report on the part of the person conveying the information. So if they say it's true and it's an environment in which they normally wouldn't lie, we can say, well, they probably aren't lying. And even the lie detection research in highly controlled environments acknowledges that ground truth is really a tricky thing.
Can the app suggest how many different writers were involved in compiling an annual report or a document?
Possible. Theoretically possible, and here's why I say that. Some of the text parsing, which is the front end technology of data that I described, where a word in a document is related to a library of words, and is it a verb, is it a whatever, that has been used in biblical studies, for example, to identify who wrote different gospels, right? And if you follow that topic at all, you may know, I think that there are thought to have been 5 writers for different versions of the gospel. And so, and that's because individuals communicate with fingerprints. And so Michael and I have run our books through it, and our fingerprints are different, and you can see just how different from looking at it. So yes, I think the way that would be implemented would be to take samples throughout the document and see if what's called language style matching is technically how that's done. If those scores fluctuate, if they're consistent based on the samples, you'd say probably one author. If they vary, then you could say section A probably written by one author, section B by another, et cetera, et cetera. But here's where it could be spoofed. I always think about how could it be spoofed. An editor might get rid of that problem, right? If the editor has carte blanche to completely change how the narrative is reported, but not the content and context of the narrative, it probably would be spoofable.
Mm-hmm.
Jason, I think we have reached time. And the truth is, we need to unfortunately end this podcast.
We do, and we would love your feedback either via email. I think all of you on here have our email addresses. Please write us. We'd love to do a product demo, obviously. If we find it endlessly fascinating and a game changer. I'll pause there. Our next podcast is going to be the 4th of March, and we're going to be talking about one of Michael's areas of expertise, something I'm fairly ignorant of, and that's succession planning. And please join us. It'll be at noon on the 4th, noon Eastern on 4th of March. Thanks so much for joining us.
So Jason will be the comic relief for that one, not me.
Exactly. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Look
all.
forward to it.
Have
Thank
a great
you very
day.
much.
Bye.
Good to be with you.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.